very good example of just how desperate the German Air Force was at the end of the war is this aircraft right here. This is a Bachem Ba-349 known as the Natter. Now, this aircraft was actually a semi-expendable rocket-propelled interceptor. Now, the aircraft itself used the same engine as the Me-163 Comet, but it was flown completely differently. For example, when this aircraft was launched, it was actually launched from two vertical launch rails straight up using these extra booster rockets in the back along with the internal rocket. Now, one of the things about this aircraft is when it took off, the pilot was not in command. The pilot was actually a passenger, and the aircraft was actually being controlled by radio from the ground. There was a radio-controlled autopilot with a gyro that kept this aircraft on course. Now, when it got up to about 20,000 feet, started closing in on the bomber streams, the pilot would finally take over control of the aircraft. Now, this aircraft was pretty crude in what it had for armament. Now, for example, the only armament on board this aircraft was a series of air-to-air unguided rockets on the nose. Now, there would be a hemispherical nose cone for aerodynamic purposes, and when the plane was closing in on the bomber formation, the pilot would jettison the nose cone on the rockets. Now, the aircraft would only be in the air for about 4 minutes. Now, the pilot, using an old ring and bead dogfighting sight, just like in World War I, would line up on his target, and he would hit a button and he would salvo the entire bunch of rockets here in the nose, hoping that one would actually hit a bomber, and all he needed was one to hit a bomber and it would knock it down. Now, the thing about this after that is this airplane by that point is pretty much out of fuel, and it was known as a semi-expendable interceptor. And what I mean by semi-expendable is that the aircraft, at that point, there's no fuel left. The pilot needs to get back down to the ground, but as you can see, there is no landing gear. What the pilot would do is he would disconnect the control column and a few bolts holding the cockpit section to the rear section or rocket section of the aircraft, and the aircraft would separate in flight. Now, the rocket section actually had a parachute to lower it back down to the ground for reuse. The pilot would climb out of what's left of the nose section, employ his own personal parachute, and all would hopefully get back down to the ground in one piece. Now, once all of the above was back on the ground, they'd get a new nose section, put it on the rocket section, refuel it, put it back on the launch rails, and find a new volunteer pilot, because usually the volunteers are pretty hard to come by, especially after once they've flown them. Now, the one flight that I know that was manned was made by a gentleman, Lieutenant Siebert. Now, he was in the aircraft, and they went ahead and closed it up, and they launched the airplane. Well, the plane, it started going up, and at about 2,000 feet, the canopy departed the aircraft, and apparently it had knocked the pilot silly. So the plane ends up going back up, over, and back down, and the pilot, Mr. Siebert, invested deep in German real estate.